So good afternoon. Again, my name is Alex Mason, Marketing Lead for QTS, and I'd like to welcome you first and foremost to our Disaster Recovery Made Easy seminar with our presenter today, President and CEO Neil Rosenberg, who's also on the line.
Hello.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. So as anybody who has touched disaster recovery might know, it's not exactly easy, but we will definitely do our best to make it easier and more attainable. So this is definitely going to be a presentation of value, and we hope you definitely enjoy it. So moving on. A little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned, today's webinar is going to be recorded, so everyone is in mute mode. Please hold your questions until the Q&A section after our call to action slide. You can also use the questions portion underneath handouts in the GoToWebinar box on the side of your screen. If you're having trouble accessing the audio portion, these are the codes to make sure that everything's on the up and up. So a little bit about us. Who is QTS? We're a Microsoft Gold partner and have been serving the New York and New Jersey greater metro area for the last 24 years. We are a managed service provider and system integrator, we were New York Metro Partner of the Year for 2013, 12, and 2008. We were also Cloud OS Partner of the Year in 2014. We pride ourselves on sticking very closely to the Microsoft framework and that methodology, and have been definitely recognized as a key partner of theirs for several years. So let's move right into today's presentation and allow me to introduce President and CEO Neil Rosenberg.
All right, thank you, Alex, and welcome everyone to our webinar on disaster recovery made easy, or at least easier. And I think that's important to state. This has been a daunting effort for many businesses and organizations. And that's why when I do seminars and present and talk with people about disaster recovery, so many organizations still don't have a really solid framework, because it's not easy. And it's not easy because there's a lot of planning and process that go into this, and frankly that's not going to change. You're just going to better understand a lot of that as a result of today's webinar. But it also is difficult because it requires technology to deliver the disaster recovery capability, and historically that's been very expensive, very complicated technology, but we're going to be talking today about new technology from Microsoft that I view as a game changer and is going to deliver these capabilities cost effectively to businesses and organizations of all sizes. So first and foremost, why are you all here? Why is disaster recovery important? There have been a whole bunch of studies on this over the last 20, 30 years, but they all statistically indicate the same range, that typically 60 to 80% of organizations impacted by a major disaster actually go out of business within 2 years. Now, I wouldn't necessarily categorize something like Sandy or 9/11 in that same range. Obviously, they were major disasters, but they were shared community disasters. And so there was a high level of understanding and camaraderie between organizations in the geographic area that was affected. But if something were to happen uniquely to your organization, the culture and tone, especially in today's globally competitive economy, wouldn't be the same. We had a law firm client of ours that was affected by 9/11, and they lost everything, and they lost everything in part because when the office manager ran out of the office, appropriately so under the circumstances, they forgot to close the door of the fireproof safe they had their tapes in. And that simple action, with the fact that they were just rotating tapes off-site and had everything on-site at the moment, was a lapse that caused them to not only lose their systems but the data. Fortunately, everyone else was very sensitive to that and they gave them the time to recover, rebuild, etc. But not all circumstances are organizations that fortunate. So it's important to understand, and this goes to the core terminology of disaster recovery, what is the business impact of the downtime that you would suffer from loss of your systems, which is what we're talking about today, but also loss of other organizational assets, which can include things like paper documents and other types of resources, as well as human knowledge and infrastructure. What would the impact be if systems were unavailable for 2 hours or 2 days or 2 weeks? You can do some back-of-the-envelope math to establish a cost, and then understanding that cost, this really comes down to an insurance decision. What's the level of investment you choose to make in order to protect your business from the possibility of incurring that cost? And again, historically, the insurance, building out systems to provide for the disaster recovery, has been very high. Well, we're going to talk about the cost of that insurance going down significantly today. What's the long-term impact on customer confidence, market position, employee retention, etc.? And you could make a decision to simply insure the cost, to actually buy insurance to cover lost revenues, etc. But that's not protecting the business's ability to function. But there's a continuum. We could put up a graph and identify where on that chart you want to be. So what are the key considerations around disaster recovery? And we've been doing these presentations, literally some of this content is as much as 10, 15 years old. It doesn't change that much, and the theory behind all this really hasn't changed that much since we started doing our Quick Recover consulting engagements with customers back in the 2000s. So key considerations are business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan. They're actually 2 different documents. And what we call, this is a QTSism, system recovery plans. This goes to our unique methodology for doing this. It was Plato who said wisdom begins with the definition of terms. So we're going to define those terms in the next slides. We're also going to talk about recovery sites. We're going to talk about communications and the critical importance of management buy-in to what's being done here. So first, what's a business continuity plan? A business continuity plan is a strategic document that outlines the risks, the impacts, the assets, all the considerations at a strategic level, and talks not about really the mechanical hows, but the whats and the whys. What are we trying to protect? Why is it important we protect it? What's the appropriate level of protection? It's the strategic plan, it's the design that outlines whether a disaster recovery plan is even necessary, and if so, what technologies and what parts of the organization should be protected on a priority level. And so understanding all that from this strategic discussion then leads to the more operational plan of what do we do if there is a disaster, and that's the disaster recovery plan, the what. And then from a QTS perspective, we coined the term system recovery plans to make that format modular. We'll come back and talk about that in a bit. But business continuity planning, even if you're not in a human resources business like professional services, even if people are not your product, maybe you're in manufacturing or retail or something like that, people should always come first. Human safety should always be the paramount consideration in any plan. There are a variety of types of events that need to be considered, so things like power problems, fire, flood, storm, earthquake, things like that could be natural events, or you could have man-made events, and they could be disasters like terrorism, but it could also be normal course of business events like a strike or a labor action or problems with communications. So there's a variety of different circumstances, and you need to understand the risks and how they relate to you. So in the New York metro area of the country, we probably don't have a super high tornado risk, but terrorism is probably more of a risk here than it is in Topeka, Kansas. So understanding the likelihood of events is also important in deciding how much insurance to put in place. And then understanding the severity of, or the business impact of, loss of an asset becomes critically important. And this ties to two important terms: recovery time objective and recovery point objective. Sorry, this isn't on the slide, but it's important. Recovery time objective is how much time can you be down? An RTO of 2 hours means it's acceptable to have to wait 2 hours before that database system to process the orders is back online. Email, some organizations would say my RTO is immediate. I can't suffer any loss of access to email. Or phone system, although I think right now people would choose email as a higher priority today than phone system. Recovery point objective is how much data loss am I willing to sustain. So in other words, if your backup and disaster recovery strategy is based on taped backups, and there's a lot of people out there that still are using tape backup. If I asked you all to raise your hands, I'm guessing about half of you would. If your strategy is based on tape backups and you run a backup overnight and then you have a disaster level event that occur at 3 in the afternoon, your recovery point objective, whether you like it or not, is you're going to lose 3/4 of a day of transactions if you have to restore from tape. So that may or may not be an acceptable solution for you depending on the business impact. So these are strategic discussions that you need to have with management because there's costs associated with the different levels of protection. And there has to be a prioritization that occurs. You can't just say protect everything equally because that's not practical for most organizations. Now, a disaster recovery plan is the document that you execute almost like a flow chart when a disaster occurs. When a disaster of a specific type occurs, here are the things that are done by these specific people, which goes to roles and responsibilities, in executing the plan. And I'm a big fan of modularity and maintainability, so we coined the term system recovery plan for a given system or what we call application chain to be recovered. So think of email as an example. You may have a critical dependence on email, but that email solution, if it's on-premise, may include anti-spam gateways. It may include an archiving system. It includes network communication paths, and any one of those links in the chain could result in an outage to that whole system. So what do they say about, the weakest link in the chain? You have to understand the relationship of the pieces in determining how you want to protect each link from an availability and a resiliency or disaster tolerance perspective. So when we do disaster recovery plans, we do the overarching DR plan, and then we do system recovery plans for each basically application chain or business function supported by technology. So a disaster recovery plan, or what are the consistent actions to be taken? That can include recovery and salvage, so you may fail over to a disaster recovery site or cloud, and yet you may have a separate team working on salvage of your on-premise environment to bring the original site back to an operational state. 2 different teams, 2 different leaders, 2 different sets of actions. One person can't execute both concurrently. How are you going to revise operations during the plan, and how are you going to handle fail back? People tend to focus on failover and then say, oh, we're good to go. Well, you got to actually be able to fail back to have a complete solution. So system recovery plans are the step-by-step process for each given system or chain of systems that delivers a business function. If you're a law firm, that might be your document management system. If you are a retail system, that might be your point of sale system, etc. These need to be super detailed, no assumptions, tested regularly, and they need to be clear enough that the plan can be executed by anyone with a reasonable level of skill. If your plan is executed by the people that maintain the systems regularly, then in the event of a disaster, if those people are not available, something happens in the disaster, then you're going to have a huge problem if there are gaps in the plan. So it's also important to have fresh eyes, do the testing and be involved in that process so that you see the steps that are missing that are in somebody's head but not on the paper. Communications, this is really important. Who declares a disaster? There's a level of judgment that needs to be applied. Failing over technology to an alternate site takes time and effort, and there's going to be a failback. You don't want to execute a failover if you believe that you're going to be back up and running in 15 minutes. But if you think it's going to be a day before you're back up and running, you want to execute that failover. I remember one of our clients that we took through this process, and they thought that they had defined what their plan was, but then the president of the company decided that he was going to be involved and make the decision. And that wasn't what the DR committee had agreed upon because it never got back to him. So that's the importance of upper management buy-in in the process. How is the plan going to be communicated internally and externally? If you're a public company, you might have to do shareholder communications. How do you manage the media? You don't want your customers to view a disaster situation as being impactful of their ability to do business with you. So somebody needs to be able to put positive spin on what's going on. What is the communication chain? Is it a, what is it in terms of people to people, but also where is it? We've implemented SharePoint solutions in the cloud as part of Office 365. In some cases, if nothing else, to hold all the disaster recovery documents, so that if there's an on-premise problem, people can just go to the cloud and look up all the documentation and workflows and emergency contact numbers and everything else that's hosted externally from the organization. So this is critically important. And then, I don't know if this is on another slide or not, but I don't want to lose the point. The criticality of communication in terms of what people are doing. We had a client that had a disaster situation. Their disaster site was about 30 miles away, so they rerouted a lot of employees by car to go to the disaster site, but this was caused by a tree coming down on power lines due to a storm. What they didn't account for, there was road flooding near the disaster recovery site. The employees couldn't actually get there. So there's things like that that are important to think through in terms of both testing the plan and also clear communications and communication medium so that you can actually react to unplanned circumstances appropriately. Define your recovery teams. We help organizations to break out what are the different functions, define personnel, including vendors, partners, and contractors. So QTS is often part of the disaster recovery team for our customers in executing on a disaster recovery plan. How do you want to share that information out? I think putting it into a cloud portal like SharePoint Online is a great way to go, and we've had a lot of success with that. Contacts with backup contacts for each responsibility. Everyone needs to know what they're doing, and if you're relying on vendors or third parties, you have to make sure they understand their role in the plan. Don't just take it as a given or assume that they'll have resources and that they'll know where to go and what to do, which again goes to the importance of testing and involving those people in the testing. All right, so let's step back and talk about disaster recovery solutions. What are the types of solutions? And we're going to talk about types of sites, and this is where we get a little bit historical here. The old way of doing things and the most simple and least expensive way of doing disaster recovery besides having nothing is having a cold site. It's having a place to go. Think of it like an empty warehouse. We don't have anything there, but in the event of a disaster, we're going to regroup and rebuild our systems here. Maybe we have our people report here as well, but more and more now with the internet and home computing and home networks, it's less important for people to go to a place and more important and practical for people to go online and connect into the DR site remotely. That simplifies the execution significantly, and that's what we're seeing most businesses do. So having a facility defined, but a cold site is cold. It has nothing there. There's no servers and PCs. There's no communications in place. Ideally, we have software license keys and media. This is something important if you want to save the time of having to re-download software and go out and re-buy software. Just make copies of your CDs or ISO images and put them in an alternate location, or have them in the cloud where they can be easily accessed, or have a document with links to the different download sites so you can get them quickly. And make sure you have all your license keys available. Put them into the SharePoint portal so that they're available from anywhere. If you are backing up your data, if it's tape, make sure that it's able to go off-site so that you can bring it to the cold site. If it's cloud, that's great. Make sure you can restore from the cold site, so you want at least your telecommunications in place. This can be the garage or the basement of a key employee for a small business, but you need to have a base camp to be able to work from. So this is the least effective way to go, but it's also the least expensive way to go. The in-between is a warm site where maybe we have servers and PCs and things ready. We just have to restore them to an operable state with applications and data. And so usually that would involve bringing your tapes, disks, media to the site and restoring yesterday's data onto those servers and systems. So your recovery point objective is going to be potentially up to 1 day of data loss, and your recovery time objective here is probably at least a day, if not 2 or 3 days, whereas your recovery point objective in the other scenario is several days because you got to buy everything and then set it up. Now, what a lot of organizations did years ago is they went to the hot site model. And so with the hot site, you have your telecommunications link, and you're actually replicating data, whether it's server to server using technology like Microsoft Hyper-V Replica, or it's SAN to SAN if you have a storage area network and perhaps using something like NetApp SnapMirror. You may have a end user environment ready for people to connect into, and if there's a disaster, you flip over to the secondary site, and at that point your recovery point objective is from when the disaster occurred and any data that's lost in transit, but it's the best recovery point objective, and your recovery time objective should be near instantaneous as well. But obviously this is the most expensive solution, because if I have a NetApp SAN at my headquarters with 40 terabytes of data and 6 Hyper-V hosts and 300 PCs, well, my hot site is going to have that same infrastructure, or at least appropriate terminal services or Citrix to support those users, and that's going to be a lot of plumbing. It's a lot of hardware to buy. It's a lot of software to license, because you usually need separate licenses when you're running hot or active to receive replication. And there's a lot of plumbing that needs to be maintained, because if you make this investment, you want to make sure that things are going to be available to be used in the event that you need to. So you also have to integrate disaster recovery into your change control process, which I'm sure everyone has, so that when you make system changes, the ramification on disaster recovery is accounted for. You can't upgrade an application in production and not consider the impact on the disaster recovery environment, or when you go to fail over, it's not going to work for you. So here's the game changer. The game changer is the cloud. In our case, as a Microsoft partner, and we feel this is the strongest solution, Azure. Essentially, it's the hot site scenario without having to buy the site. You can use the cloud with the pre-built capacity and turn it on as needed, perhaps paying for storage as you use it to receive replicated VMs and data, but then paying for compute capability, memory, CPU, etc., in the event of actual disaster. And we have a client that we looked at for this, and the cost to do disaster recovery using the Azure solution was about 1/4 the cost in recurring cost. There's a competing major industry solution. And then the ongoing, in the event of running in a disaster, was about the same or slightly higher. So it's a very cost-effective solution, especially because you don't have to pay for capacity you're not using. More about this to follow. So examples on the evolution of disaster recovery. Years ago, for one of our clients, the Weinbow Group up in Montvale, New Jersey, they've recently merged and expanded their operations, but we set up for them a NetApp environment, did replication with SnapMirror, VMware, Site Recovery Manager, and it worked really well. It was complex plumbing, it was expensive, but we built off the existing environment and built a solution and tested it at least annually to make sure that it met their needs in the event of disaster, and when they did have problems, the solution worked for them. That's probably the most expensive way to go in terms of a hot site because of the sand-to-sand replication and all the moving parts, but it's a great solution when you build it. And we can do something similar now in the Microsoft world. An alternate example is Wilentz Goldman Spitzer, a longtime law firm client of ours, where we also implemented NetApp SANS and did data replication from the LUNs on their SANS for data protection, but used Hyper-V and specifically Hyper-V Replica to protect the virtual machines. So in this case, we were able to deliver the solution in the Microsoft world at a far lesser software cost, leveraging Hyper-V to take advantage of those savings with a Microsoft solution. But we still needed a SAN, and we still did SAN-to-SAN replication for data protection. What we're doing now with a number of customers, I don't have any customer names on here yet because these the major projects are in progress, but all going very well and with successful outcomes thus far, is using Microsoft Azure Site Recovery, where we are setting up replication of Hyper-V virtual machines, VMware virtual machines, and physical servers into Microsoft Azure with the ability to turn them up and run those systems in the cloud, both in test mode, so protected test bubble like Site Recovery Manager lets you do, in the event that you're running a test, or actually to fail over into the cloud and pay as you go in terms of compute resources in the event of an actual disaster. And we have clients that are going to be doing a few to dozens to potentially even hundreds of servers following this approach. So this is the modern method of disaster recovery, and this is how, at least from a technical perspective, we can deliver disaster recovery made easy. So more to follow on the details of that. Now the key to this is Azure, and I don't have time in our full 3-hour seminar. We go through a module from our What is Azure and Why Should I Care webinar. We're not going to be able to do that today, but if you go to our YouTube channel, search for QTS NJ on YouTube, Quality Technology Solutions, you will see all of our recorded webinars, and one of them is called What is Azure and Why Should I Care? And that'll tell you a lot more than I can go into right now about Azure. But for the moment, think of it as your network in the cloud. I can use it for storage, I can use it to run virtual machines, I can use it to run applications. So let's now dig into specifically protecting your Microsoft environment. So when we look at the technology for data protection, disaster recovery, we need to look at the continuum of solutions ranging from physical servers to virtual servers to hybridized environments between cloud and on-premise to pure cloud scenarios. How do we deliver resiliency and disaster tolerance across all four? And Microsoft solutions do account for this. Number one, in terms of the core solutions, we have Hyper-V failover and clustering, the ability to sustain hardware failure and failure of specific components by moving workloads to other components in the cluster. And that's a solution that's been around for a long time, works great on Hyper-V, works great on other platforms. As we look at the next level of this, how do we protect our data? And that can be, in the traditional world, backup to tape or disk, or our more modern approach that we do with a lot of clients is backup to the cloud. And we have a set of offerings under our Quick Backup branding that addresses this with different solutions based on different size and type of business. But on the Microsoft world specifically, we have Azure Backup, the ability to run backups from Azure to protect VMs in Azure or on-premise. And the ability to integrate with Data Protection Manager should we need application-aware backups and snapshots. So there's a couple different solutions here that you can dig into and we can review with you under the Azure Backup and Data Protection Manager branding. And then lastly, application level safeguarding, and this is what we're going to talk about as we talk about Azure Site Recovery, as well as data protection technologies around specific Microsoft workloads. So how do we protect your data and the ability to restore your data if needed? First, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but at the most basic level, Windows Server has built-in backup capabilities. You can back up specific files. You can define protection groups. So you have a rudimentary backup capability built into Windows Server that you can then use to protect your data. And you can have Azure potentially be a backup target for that and do backup to the cloud with the current version of Windows Server. And that includes volume shadow copy. Data Protection Manager is Microsoft's backup solution that is part of System Center. So technically it is System Center Data Protection Manager. It's been a kind of siloed technology because you had to buy all of System Center to get access to it. But think of it as a technology that competes with tools like Backup Exec or ArcServe to allow you to run backups that are application aware, things like SQL and Exchange and SharePoint, but that also allows you to back up into the cloud, into Azure, because it's specifically designed for that. The downside to date, and it has integrations with the rest of System Center, the downside to date is that you had to buy the whole System Center suite to have access to it. However, if you do some checking on Azure Backup, you actually have an ability to license the technology now as part of Azure. And that's where with Azure Backup integration we can protect our data off-site using Data Protection Manager for the more granular backups that Azure Backup by itself can't do, including application-aware and VM-aware backups and snapshots. Azure also has the ability, if we're running virtual machines in the cloud, to replicate those VMs to other Azure instances, so we can essentially do geographic redundancy of our data. Maybe our data is in an Azure data center on the East Coast, but we want to replicate it to a data center on the West Coast. We can do that, but bear in mind also that replication and backup are two different concepts. That replication, if a file is deleted, that file deletion will be replicated to the other target. Whereas backup allows you to restore that deleted file even if it has been replicated to multiple targets. So Azure Backup would be a solution to back up the VMs in Azure, whereas we can replicate for geo-redundancy using native Azure functionality. SQL Server has a range of data protection technologies depending on the version. We had pure SQL backups, we had log shipping, we had clustering, and then various forms of replication, asynchronous and synchronous. To define terms, asynchronous is I send data and I hope it gets there, and if it doesn't, it doesn't, which is what most products will do. Synchronous is I write to disk A, I send the write to disk B, but I don't confirm the write on disk A until disk B confirms it's got it. So synchronous requires low latency, appropriate bandwidth so that the pipes don't get clogged, and it will adversely impact production if it's not implemented the right way, whereas asynchronous is more tolerant but less reliable. So you have to understand the differences between the two technologies to pick the right one for your environment. And then SQL Always On was added with SQL Server 2014 and now is enhanced in SQL Server 2016. And Always On is essentially the equivalent in SQL of database availability groups for Exchange. It's replication of databases across multiple SQL servers with multiple copies of the database. So very cool technology that gives you a whole nother capability for data protection. And then lastly, Active Directory, which is really a matter of proper Active Directory design across multiple sites, which we now typically include an Azure site in that, whether connected via site-to-site VPN or connected via Azure Express Route for a high-performance private connection between your network and Azure. So understanding your Active Directory architecture and just making sure you have appropriate resilience, synchronization, and health of the environment. This is critical that your Active Directory be separate, that you have Active Directory replication independent of failover, because AD needs to be there as VMs come up for them to appropriately synchronize, take time, and work well together. So Active Directory design and failover needs to be a separate consideration in this. So now we get application specific. How do we safeguard our applications? What is Azure Site Recovery and why should I care? So Azure Site Recovery is essentially a technology that Microsoft developed around Azure and Hyper-V that last year they significantly extended and enhanced through acquisition of a technology that they integrated into Azure. They bought a company called InMage that had a technology called InMage Scout, which was a data replication technology for VMware and physical servers. And over the last year or so, Microsoft has not only integrated the people from that company into the Azure team, but also integrated the technology into Azure to make it a seamless stack. And in December or so, made two major changes that made the VMware failover, failback just much, much better and kind of opened the doors from our perspective. So first thing we can do from an Azure Site Recovery perspective is Azure Site Recovery can manage Hyper-V to Hyper-V replication on-premise. It can also manage Hyper-V to Hyper-V replication of SAN data on-premise or Hyper-V to Azure replication, VMware or physical server to VMware replication, and VMware or physical server to Azure replication. So those 5 scenarios are all in play here from the standpoint of using Azure Site Recovery for disaster recovery. And Azure Site Recovery can be consumed as part of an Azure subscription. QTS can provide that to you as part of our Cloud 9 offering we're going to talk about later, our Cloud 9 hosted services offering. Or you can do that if you're an enterprise agreement customer through the Operations Management Suite, or OMS, which includes several additional components to Site Recovery, including Azure Backup and Azure Automation and Operational Insights. So what this does is it essentially gives you orchestrated, scripted, and managed disaster recovery, whether it's from one site to another site or from one site to Azure itself. The way it works is that you use Hyper-V Replica or the Azure Site Recovery technology to configure replication into Azure, and then you can essentially configure the replication intervals, 30 seconds, 5 minutes, or 15 minutes, and create runbooks or scripts to manage the failover process. And you can also create a environment where you can bring up an isolated environment to test without affecting your production environment. So part of the key here is creation of recovery plans. That's kind of separate from, but it's related in concept to our system recovery plans. A recovery plan in Azure Site Recovery essentially documents the automated steps that occur to execute the failover into the DR site. So it's an orchestrated runbook that will essentially run the process of turning up the disaster recovery site specific to your configuration and your applications. And you can also use scripting, PowerShell, to automate the process further. You can also have manual actions. This is one of the classic questions on disaster recovery, is how much do I want to be automated and how much do I want to control? So you have flexibility to be able to control that in how you set up your scripts and runbooks. We can do tests while live and simulating the failover into an isolated network, or you can actually run the failover if you need to, which is the whole point of the exercise. And you can do failovers into the cloud. One thing you actually have the option to do is use Azure Site Recovery initially as a way to protect your virtual machines, but then ultimately fail them over into the cloud and leave them there if you choose to. So it actually can be a migration methodology as well. And the idea is to have a consistent set of tools for on-premise and Azure, which would be the same whether it's VMware, Hyper-V, or physical servers. We just have some differences in agents and configuration, but essentially it's the same technology. And you're using Azure Virtual Networking to control where the virtual machines reside and how everything maps according to the runbooks. So the idea here is to have heterogeneous disaster recovery for Hyper-V, for VMware, and for physical servers. The value proposition is the ability to protect those various platforms. The ability, because this is replication, and don't forget replication is not backup, as I said, to have a near zero recovery point objective. If I'm replicating in 30-second intervals, I'm not likely to have much data loss. The ability to have application consistency across multiple VMs. Recovery time objective, I can be up and running very quickly through that orchestration and automation. And this is, at this point, a very mature platform, in part because the core replication engines, Hyper-V Replica and the Enmage technology, have been in use for years. It's just now leveraging the Azure platform as the cloud hot site that's the relatively newer piece of it, combining the technologies. And so the idea here is to essentially have a couple of different server components that provide that VMware and physical server replication. But what happened in December was two things. Number one, these different servers, the process server, config server, and master target server, used to have to be separate servers or VMs. They were basically SaaSized, software as a service, so that most of this is now just part of Azure. You just basically turn it on instead of having to build virtual machines and configure servers and agents. So it's a much faster deployment for us now. Got a couple of days of work out of our services, so you have more money to spend on the planning part of it. And the other thing that was significant is they introduced technology to replicate data back. Remember I talked about recovery and salvage? Well, at some point you may want to set up your equipment, maybe the power comes back on, maybe you replace the servers that failed, and then at that point you replicate your data back and keep it in sync like you would with other replication technologies, so that when you're ready to fail back to on-site, if you choose to, you can do so without the major operational challenges that you had in prior versions of the product. Those two things from a QTS perspective opened up this game for the VMware world, for all our VMware customers, to be able to say, okay, this is not only a good solution for Hyper-V customers, this is a really good solution for VMware customers as well. And so speaking to that, streamlined protection, we have the VMware environment documented and incorporated into the cloud. We select the appropriate configurations and configure the replication settings, and we have the ability to have insight into the environment in terms of what workloads we're protecting and are all the pieces of infrastructure for failover healthy. So efficient recovery. The recovery is wizard-based and script-based, so it's easy to step through depending on what you define it as in your environment, and also easy to step through from a testing perspective. which is critical. You know, we always recommend testing occur at least annually, but if the technology is this easy to work with, you can potentially accelerate that pace and do tests on a quarterly basis. Or if you have us outsource that as a service for you, we can do it as a managed service and take that off your plate. Okay, so the idea here is not only using the cloud to manage the DR failover, but the 2015-2016 way of doing it is to replicate from on-premise into the cloud and use the cloud not as the orchestration engine, but for the failover itself. So in the Microsoft world, the supported hosts are Hyper-V, different flavors of 2012 or 2008. The target is essentially Azure or current Hyper-V. Replication essentially becomes, with these changes, it's just Azure Site Recovery, and the availability piece is old. That's all available today because we're working with customers. So when would you choose it? Well, if you have a secondary site available, we can do replication site to site and use Azure Site Recovery as the console and control plane. If you're using Virtual Machine Manager, it's a great integration with the rest of System Center. If you've got unprotected workloads, it's a fairly time and cost-effective way to protect those supplemental workloads. And if you can benefit from, you know, increasing your RTO and your RPO. When would it not work? Really two things. Number one, this is asynchronous replication. Remember what I said. It's writing data locally and then throwing it over the wall to Azure, and hopefully everything gets there, and it usually does. But if you require synchronous replication because your RPO is so tight and the impact of data loss is intolerable to lose anything, then this may not be the right solution for you. For most of you, this is probably better than what you have. And if the workload you're protecting is not a VHD Hyper-V, VMDK, VMware, or physical server disk drive, if you're, for example, using Citrix Xen or Linux virtualization or something like that, we can't help you there with this technology. All right, so to bring this home, I'm going to shift back away from the technology and talk a little bit about the process. And this is an oldie but goodie, 10 steps to implement your disaster recovery plan. Drum roll optional. So, number one, define your assets. What are the assets? What are you concerned about protecting? What's the impact of loss? How long can you withstand that loss? So clearly understand and prioritize what you're protecting. Number two, define the recovery threshold. What is the RTO? What is the RPO? Part of that determines when would you declare a disaster versus potentially staying down until the system can be turned back on. Number three, define recovery solutions. Based on each asset, or you could say application chain, based on the recovery window, what is the appropriate solution? Are we okay with just a cold site and tape backup? Do we need tape backup and a warm site? Do we need data replication in a hot site? Are we in need of Azure for everything? Azure Site Recovery may not be the full solution. Maybe you want to do Azure Site Recovery for most of your workloads, but use SQL synchronous replication specifically for SQL Server workloads that have a zero tolerance recovery point objective. So you need to understand what you're protecting to make the right decisions on how to protect them. Based on that, draft the disaster recovery plan. What are the assets and how they're going to be protected? And this kind of also includes the business continuity plan at a higher level, but build the DR plan and potentially the BC plan, define the teams, define the communication process. What are the logistics? Review the plan and refine it. You can set to do this out yourself. You can go find templates, go read books, go to classes, or you can contact us about our Quick Recover service offerings where we do workshops with you and use our pre-existing templates to create your plan for you quickly and with that business consensus that you would need to make the plan effective and operable, including the management buy-in. Number 5, establish the communication plan. So what are the scenarios? Who's empowered to declare a disaster? What's the communication process? Who's part of that chain? To us, this is all part of the DR plan, but a lot of times I hear people talk about this and they ignore the communications part and just focus on the technology. The technologies are actually in the system recovery plans the way we do it. Build and plan your site. Are you using the cloud, hot site, warm site, cold site? If you're using things like a branch office or a hot site, is it too close geographically? Is it too away geographically? Who's going to execute the failover in terms of people? Do we want them to be close by, far away? What's the cost versus quality, etc. So just understand your options. I think Azure is the home run option here. But there's a lot to consider in choosing what's right for you. When you have this built, how are users going to access it? You need an access layer. That could be Citrix, that could be terminal services, RDS, it could be Azure Remote App, which is essentially terminal services run from Azure in the cloud. It could be VDI, Citrix, VMware, or Microsoft. Or it could be a building with a big room and a lot of physical computers that people go to. But how are people going to actually use the systems in the event of failover? And what's the remote access and communication? And do people have clear instructions so they know what to do and can do it? That should actually be part of the test. Document the plan. Create detailed documentation of the business continuity plan, the disaster recovery plan, the system recovery plans with failover and failback instructions, and define the different potential situations and how to manage and recover from them. Step 9, test. This is so critical. I know lots of people that went through the time and effort to build stuff and didn't test it, and I guarantee you if you don't test it, it will not work right the first time. This is just the way these things are. It's an iterative process. Test it. Have there's a process called checklist testing where you go through the plan without actually executing it, but you sit around a table and talk through everything, or you actually do the test and simulate the disaster and then go through and do an analysis. What went right? What went wrong? What did we learn? What do we want to change? And implement those changes timely. And then keep it refined and run retests. Integrate disaster recovery with your change control process so that it is very clear that when you need to rely on the plan is up to date and the plan and the technology will be there for you when you need it. If you don't retest and you don't maintain, a year from now, the plan will probably not work because your environment will be changing, and if the plan and technology doesn't keep pace with those changes, the failover will fail, and all the investment you made will have been wasted. It will give you a bonus step. Leverage the cloud, specifically Azure Site Recovery, but the cloud generally. If it's in the cloud, it's probably going to be unaffected by your physical locations, your property, etc. One of the home run reasons we do a ton of Exchange Online Office 365 work, the biggest 3 reasons that people tell me they want to go to Office 365, or I eventually tell them after we discuss it and they understand it, is number 1, they want to get that storage off their network. Number 2, they want to free up staff time from managing Exchange. But then really critically, number 3, they want to get Exchange out of the disaster recovery planning and have redundancy and disaster recovery built into the solution. And there are ways to insulate against risk of Microsoft outages. That's a whole separate discussion we can have with you. But moving your email to the cloud separate from what we talked about with Azure Site Recovery is a great move, because then when you go through your priority list of Tier 1, Tier 2, 3 applications, Well, email isn't even on the list. It's tier 0 because it's already been isolated from the rest of your production environment. You don't have to worry about email failover, and in fact, you can use Exchange Online to communicate during the disaster, and you can use SharePoint Online as the portal for your disaster recovery documentation so everyone knows where to go for instructions, communication, and information during the disaster. So this is a great step forward. Microsoft is actually empowered in 2 different ways, through Azure Site Recovery, but also through Office 365. That's making disaster recovery tremendously easier. Not easy, but tremendously easier than it would be otherwise. So there's still a lot of dependencies, but the cloud really can be your secret weapon in making this what is now a potentially very accomplishable goal. So we covered a lot of ground, and after we finish the wrap-up, we'll open up for Q&A. And again, please use the questions window in the GoToWebinar control panel, or we'll unmute the audience as we wind down. But I'll turn it back over to Alex Mason to kind of take us home and wrap up the event.
Great, thanks Neil, I really appreciate it. That was super informative, and I know I gleaned a lot of information out of that. So as I mentioned earlier, we're tied very closely. All of our solutions are based off the Microsoft Solutions Framework. And as Neil mentioned, we do have a new offering under the Cloud.9 branding, specifically tailored to Azure Recovery. So let's move to our call to action. Okay, and Neil, do you want to explain?
Sure. So in terms of calls to action, we'd be happy to have a meeting, phone call to discuss with you your disaster recovery goals and needs and how we can help you with that. It doesn't directly tie to disaster recovery, but Azure Site Recovery is part of Azure. So if you have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft and planning services vouchers, we can use those vouchers to do some planning around implementing Azure and ASR in your environment. And then we have packaged services, we call them quick starts, to implement these technologies with you, either directly or in a knowledge transfer capacity, to help you get up and running. Or going back to that solutions framework chart, we can deploy the whole life cycle from planning through deployment and testing through migration and full implementation. And if any of you as webinar attendees are interested in this discussion, we have a special discount for webinar attendees who move forward with one of our quick starts or packaged offerings within 30 days of today's event. So speak to me or your QTS account manager if you're interested in follow-up. I'll leave it to you, Alex, to talk about our upcoming events and social channels.
Absolutely. So our next upcoming event is going to be held on May 12th at Microsoft New York City. It's getting more out of Office 365 with our ISV partners Mimecast and Nintex, as well as our training partner CTG. Coming up on the docket, we have maximizing Salesforce effectiveness using Microsoft CRM, as well as what's new in SharePoint 2016, as well as what's new in OMS. You can definitely follow us on Twitter at QTSNJ, follow us on LinkedIn. We'll send out a recording, or in our follow-up email, we'll send out a link to our YouTube channel where you can view all of our past recordings of webinars and seminars. And I'd like to make a special announcement. Please join us September 13th in Microsoft at the New York City office for QuikInVision 2016. If you haven't seen the social posts about it, you live under a rock because we've been talking about it all week. We're very excited and can't wait to see you all there. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Neil or myself. And now we will open it up for questions.